Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. We're looking at the seven churches of Asia Minor. We're trying to find out and ask one question as we look at these verses, and that is, are we that church? I never heard such big yapping back there. No. Anyway, I think it's the weather. As we all know, our next door neighbors here have chickens. And I hadn't heard chickens in a long time. And I began to wonder, to be honest, whether he maybe had gotten rid of his chickens. And today I came out at lunch and a couple of them evidently had just laid an egg. And this evening when I came out, the rooster must have thought it was sunrise instead of sunset. And they were just having big, it's the weather. But anyway, we're asking the question, are we that church? We're trying to give a little bit of a background from the standpoint of the church itself, and then look at the text, and then come up with 2, 3, 4 different things that we can learn from the text that will help us as a church, help us as individuals, and we go from there. Smyrna is the church today. This is one of those. There's only 2. We've talked about that a couple of times before, but this is one of 2 of the 7 churches that only good things are said about them. Only good things are said to them. And so Smyrna is a blessed place, if you will, blessed church. We do not know from the standpoint of biblical text, we do not know exactly when this church itself began. If you look at Acts chapter 19, you remember that Paul is on his 3rd missionary journey. And being on his 3rd missionary journey, Paul spends about 3 years at Ephesus. He uses Ephesus as his hub. Now, he doesn't just stay in Ephesus those 3 years, but he comes back and forth. But it is while he is using Ephesus as his hub that if you look in Acts 19, verse 10, it says, and this continued for 2 years, so that all who dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. You might say, well, why is that important? Well, Smyrna was only about 40 miles north of Ephesus. We studied Ephesus last week. So it's very probable, and we don't know, like I say, don't know for a fact, but very probable that the church at Smyrna was established by Paul somewhere in his 3rd missionary journey. The city itself was a beautiful city. It was called the Ornament of Asia. It was known for its beauty. It began about 1000 BC, some have said, is when it was founded. It was nestled on the Aegean Sea and at the base of Mount Pegasus. It was destroyed in 600 BC. 300 years later, though, a man by the name of Clackamas, and while we may not be able to say his name, he was one of the generals of Alexander the Great. And he, for lack of a better term, he succeeded Alexander the Great. Well, he decided, and he took a liking to Smyrna. And so he rebuilt Smyrna about 300 BC. And it is there that he actually, interestingly enough, he hoarded gold there. And we'll talk about that in just a second. It is known, or was known, Smyrna was known for its harbors. It was a maritime city, had great commerce. They were very loyal to Rome. Now get this. They were very loyal to Rome. If Revelation is dated when I think that it was, in the late 80s, early 90s, probably early 90s, that John was exiled on the Isle of Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation. There was an emperor by the name of Domitian that was about that time. And Domitian was one of those Roman emperors that thought that everybody ought to worship him. He thought that being an emperor made him God. And so consequently, Smyrna had, at least most of the folks, many of the folks in this city, had given themselves over to the idea of emperor worship. And so emperor worship was a big religion, if you will, at that time. Very loyal, as we said, to Rome. Great beauty, great wealth. Folks that had money lived there. It was the center for science and medicine. So advanced was Smyrna. It had paved streets, and it had colonnades, as we talked about Ephesus last week. It had colonnades down the streets. There was one city, or one street, I guess you could call it, that was interesting in Smyrna. It was actually called the Street of Gold. It was well paved, well maintained. It was beautiful. There were a lot of Greek gods. Not only did Smyrna practice the idea of emperor worship, but they were heavily involved in the worship of the Greek gods. And so they had a lot of temples and a lot of statues around to commemorate and to make sure that they maintained that sort of religious practice. The markets were the main attraction. It did have, interesting enough, it had a stadium. And I'm going to talk to you about the stadium in just a minute. But it had a stadium. It also had a theater. Now remember, they didn't have TV. So they had theaters then. And they were really like what we would call arenas or coliseums. But there in Smyrna, they had a theater that would seat 20,000 people. Rather large, to say the least. In 177 BC, an earthquake destroyed the city again. Now remember, it was destroyed in 600, rebuilt in 300. In 177 BC, it had an earthquake. It was destroyed. But Marcus Aurelius, you may have heard of him, he helped to rebuild Smyrna again. This was also the place, the stadium itself, was where Polycarp was put to death. You may have heard of Polycarp. Polycarp was a man that lived, let me get the dates exactly right. Well, he was martyred in 157 AD, which is interesting because if you fix the time frame, and I'll show you something a little later, but if you fix the time frame, that would put you about 90 AD. But Polycarp, if you know a lot of ancient church history, was a good friend of John. And Polycarp was put to death well, not of John, but of Irenaeus. But Polycarp was a man that was a child of God, Christian, and probably did know John. He wrote a lot about John. Polycarp was brought to the stadium in the midst of all of this idea of emperor worship and was told that if he denied the Lord, and if he would say that he was pledging himself, aligning himself to the emperor, that his life would be saved. And Polycarp said, 86 years have I served my Lord, and he has never done anything harmful to me. Why would I give him up now? Polycarp also was then threatened with fire. They were going to set him on fire, which was a common practice. Christians in that day and age, they dip you in a tar-like material or goo, if you will, and they'd light you. Domitian, Caligula used Christians to light their gardens. They became human torches at night, and that's how they lit their gardens at night. But they also threatened Polycarp with fire. And he said, you threaten me with fire, but you know nothing of the fire of which you're about to receive. And he went on to explain a little bit about hell to him. And so he stood up, and he stood up for God. And you might say, well, why is that important? It's important because of what we're about to see. What we're about to see in this text. It helps us a lot. But these were things that were going on. Now let's get to the text. Revelation chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. and going through verse 11. And to the angel of the church at Smyrna write, this is the way that all of the 7 epistles start. And we talked last week about this idea of the word angel. It's the word angelos, which is translated angel correctly. And we often think of a heavenly being. But the word angelos can also mean messenger. And so what is believed is that either these epistles were being delivered to, say, either an elder or to a messenger from these respective churches. And they were being used sort of as a carrier to carry these epistles back from John to the places of Asia Minor where they reside, such as Ephesus and Smyrna this week, and the others that we'll talk about in the coming weeks. But notice that it says, to the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. Now, remember what we said last week. First thing that in each of these epistles that Jesus does is he acknowledges or identifies himself. And think about each one has meaning in and of themselves. I mean, you could just take that sentence and you can make a really good sermon out of it. Somebody else could. But you can make a really good sermon out of it. But it had bearing on what's about to be said. Think about what he says, though. He says, these things says the first and the last. Much like what he said last week. Remember, he referred to himself what? With the alpha and the omega, right? First and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Well, he says, I'm the first and the last. How is that possible? He's the first, in that he's always been. He was with the Father at creation. He was the one through whom the Father created this world and all things therein. He's the last, and then he's the very last, who will always be. Who was dead and came to life. That's what's important. Think about that. He's talking about his what? Resurrection. He said, I was dead. Now remember, this is Jesus talking. I was dead. I'm the first and last. I was dead, but I'm not dead. I was not dead, and I'm not dead any longer. I came back to life. The resurrection of Jesus holds one of the great blessings for us all. We probably don't preach enough about the resurrection of Jesus, but if you go back and study the subject of the resurrection, and the reason, I think one of the reasons is because it's one of those deals where once you mention it, everybody's light bulb goes off and says, yeah, I remember, talking about it, but there's not many ways you can chase that rabbit. It's sort of like chasing them in one hole and not a bunch. But the resurrection of Jesus was important because if you go back to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul said the resurrection was important because it made sure that our faith was true, that our preaching was true, and that ultimately you could say that we have hope. There's hope beyond this life. That if this life comes to an end, it's going to be all right. There is that which lies beyond. And so when he says, I was dead and came to life, that has meaning for what is about to be said. But it has meaning for all of us as well. That there is that which lies beyond this world. Then he says in verse 9, he once Jesus identifies himself, he talks about judgment. There's not really a judgment. There is a judgment from the standpoint of he says, I know, but it's not a condemnation judgment that he passes upon Smyrna. And verse 9, he talks about judgment, but then he makes an appeal also in verse 9 and verse 10. And that's sort of those three ingredients are found in all of these 7 letters. And we talked about that last week. We'll talk about this week. We'll talk about those that remain. But notice what he says. I know the word. It's not an I guess, or I think, or I suppose. The word know here is very interesting word. It's the idea of a comprehensive know. In other words, I know this. I'm not guessing. I'm not supposing. I told you about the individual once that came in and was talking to me, and he stopped and he said, I know what you're thinking. And he had done that to me before. And so I told him what I was thinking. He said, no, that wasn't what you were thinking. And it was. I'm honest. I'm truthful. I tell the truth. And it was. But he claimed to know what I was thinking. He didn't know. He had no clue. Jesus here says, I know. I don't have to guess. I don't have to think. I don't have to suppose. I'm not even filling in the blanks. There are no blanks as far as I'm concerned. I know your works. I know what you do. He says, tribulation and but you're rich. I know your works. I know what you're doing. But I know your tribulation. The word tribulation has the idea of being pressed down. It's the idea that Rucker talks about in his treatment of the book of Revelation. He talks about the huge wheels. We've talked about this before, the grinding wheels that they used in biblical times. Oftentimes you'd have one, especially in the city, and the wheel itself may weigh a ton, 2,000 pounds. And so he says, I know your tribulation. You're being pressed down. The persecution, the problems, the uprising, because Christians and Christianity at this time are not favored. I mean, it was to be said to be a Christian was terrible. Now remember, Polycarp's a lot later, but remember we talked about it. Talked about how he died. Jesus says, I know what you're going through. I know your tribulation. I know your hurt. I know what they're doing to you. And I know your poverty. The poverty here is probably more of a material poverty, not a spiritual poverty, because notice what it says in parentheses, but you are rich. Now, we don't know what their poverty or why they were impoverished. Speculation, pure speculation, is that the Roman government had probably taken away their commerce, their right to trade, their money. They had taken away everything. Why? Because they were Christians and because they could. The Jews hated Christians. And so consequently, they were impoverished. Maybe some have speculated that maybe even their businesses were boycotted because they were Christians. We don't know why, but evidently it's a fact because Jesus is stating they were impoverished. So he says, I know your tribulation, I know your work, I know your poverty, but I want you to know you're really rich. You're really rich. As I was thinking about that this morning and reading it again and studying it, I thought a little axiom came in my head. My parents never did have much. But Dad often talked about the $2 million that he had. And he's talking about the two kids that he had, me and Carol. And he said, if he said that once, there's no telling how many times he said it. He said, no, I'm rich. I'm rich. Well, Jesus is reminding these folks they're rich. But the richness is the spiritual blessings. We talked about that in the invitation, so we'll not go over it again. He says, and I know the blasphemy. Now, we think of blasphemy of what? Holy Spirit. But the word blasphemy just literally means to speak against. It's actually two words, compound words in Greek. And it means to speak against. It's the idea of slander. You ever been slandered? Ain't it fun? I have. Probably most of you have. But it says, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not. You might say, would that really happen? Look at Matthew. Let's just see if it would really happen. Matthew chapter 10, verse 25. There's an interesting little verse there that just kind of coincides with this. Matthew chapter 10, verse 25. Jesus is talking to individuals. He's This is where he sends out the apostles in the limited commission, and limited, remember, because of where they went and the time they went. And he, as he sends them out, and he gives them this commission, he is telling them about the things to come with regards to persecution. In verse 25 of Matthew 10, it says, "It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household?" In other words, Jesus is telling the apostles as he's sending them out on the limited commission, he says, "Hey, they've called me Beelzebub, so be ready. They're going to call you all kinds of names. If they call the disciple, if the disciples like his teacher, the servants like his master, and if they call me Beelzebub, Beelzebub who's who? Yeah, Prince of Demons. Yes." He says, if they call me that, they'll call you that and other things as well. So there was this blasphemy going on. Well, who are these Jews that are not Jews? Not fake Jews, probably. But the thought is, and this one is a little bit, maybe a little bit farther fetched to grasp. But maybe he's talking about, they say they're Jews, but they're not of Jewish, as we would think of it with regards to how Paul used it in the book of Romans. Remember, Paul talked about Israel, and he was talking about the church. He was talking about Christians. These sects were pretending to be of followers, but were not. It could be that that's who he's talking about. It could be that they were, simply put, they were proclaiming to be Jews, but they were really Romans. They pretended to be religious and righteous, but they were not. We really don't know, but we just know that he says they were Jews, but they're really not Jews, but are a synagogue. Synagogue is the idea of a congregation, a gathering. Synage is the Greek word. It means to gather together. He says they're gathering of Satan. And he uses the word Satan, the word we call it Satan, and that's the way we should talk. But the original is Satan, and it just simply means adversary. He says they claim to be Jews. They're not. They're of the gathering of Satan. They are of gathering of the adversary. So he says, verse 10, "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer." This is a prophetic. He says, don't fear what you're about to suffer. Now, can you imagine? Here you are, Church of Smyrna, and let's just say this is, let's just say 80, 90. We'll round numbers off, just so I can do it fast in my head. If the church was started in the second missionary journey, our third missionary journey, excuse me, you're talking about somewhere around 57, 58, 59. So you're only talking about a church being around for 30 years. I mean, you've got first generation Christians that at best are only 30-year Christians. So the church itself would be one that would be made up of a lot of infant Christians. And there would be fear that would come back. But Jesus is telling them a couple of things. First of all, don't fear. And second of all, know that you're about to suffer. What's coming is coming. The suffering is coming. But don't fear. Now you see why he said that he was the first and the last, that he was the one that was dead but now is alive. Don't fear, because they knew they'd be put to death. They knew that Rome would truly kill them. And he said, don't fear. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison. Not the devil himself, but who? Commission, Rome, but more than likely, the Jews. That couldn't stand Christianity because, now think about it from this standpoint. And Domitian fits is what the Roman Empire, the Romans didn't like Christians either. Romans didn't like Christians because why? They weren't worshiping the emperor. The Jews didn't like Christians. Why? Because Christianity was a threat to their religion. They thought, well, Christians are trying to take over the world. They're trying to tell us how to do things, and we don't want any part of that. And they're not God's people. We're God's people. We need to get rid of them. But indeed, the devil, Rome, Roman citizens, the Jews, is about to throw some of you into prison. Once again, that predictive idea of suffering, that you may be tested. Nobody likes to be tested. But yet, at the same time, too, we know that difficult times, persecution, trials, produce a lot of good. Now, we don't like that idea. Like the idea of hurting, we don't like that idea. But it does produce a lot of good. Suffering allows us sort of to refocus, to realize and remember that our eyes are not set on this world, but on that which is above. That it helps us to remember that there are things that we can't do, but there's nothing that God can't do. And so there's a lot of blessings in suffering. And he says, know this, that you'll be thrown in prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation in 10 days. Now you can look at that 10 days, and you can look at it in one of two ways. You can look at it and say, well, they're only going to have tribulation for 10 days. That's not bad. Anybody can endure that. But also remember that throughout the book of Revelation, especially starting in the 4th chapter and going through the end, we talked about the first lesson. We just gave an introduction to the book of Revelation. But we talked about the apocalyptic literature of which John wrote in this book. And it's in signs and symbols, and to mean something to the audience, but not to anyone else that didn't know, if you will, the code. And so if you go through and you look at the book of Revelation, you see a lot of numbers. 666 and 7 and things of this thing. Well, what's 10? Well, 10 is complete. 10 in biblical times had the connotation of complete. It also had the connotation of just being exactly what it should be. So you can't say, if you want to look at this and say, well, they had tribulation 10 days, okay. If you wanted to say that they had a complete difficult time of persecution and trials, that's where I lean. But you have to come, I think, to your own conclusion there. But he says, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Be faithful. So he admonishes them, be faithful, stick with it, stay true to God, stay true to the word. Don't give up because of the persecution. Don't let the trials, don't let the tribulation, don't let the suffering, don't let it stop you. He says, you be faithful even to the point of dying. We often have used this verse, and there's nothing wrong with the way we've used it. No, I'm not saying that. But we've often used this verse to talk about stay faithful till you die. But literally, the verbiage in it, if you go back to the original, is be faithful up to the point of dying. In other words, die for the cause. So he says, be faithful in death. And if you are, he says, I will give you the crown of life. There are a couple of words that are used in the Bible or translated in the Bible. It's crown. One of them is the crown, the jewel encrusted crown that is the diadem that's beautiful. And the other one was a crown that was like an olive branch kind of twisted together, laid a lot of times on the Olympian's head as a sign of victory. This individual is victorious, because in those days That's all they got was that wreath placed upon their head. They didn't get a gold medal and a silver medal and a bronze medal. They got the wreath placed upon their head. That was a sign of victory. And that's the word that's used here. It's not the big diadem, the jewel encrusted. It's the idea of the victor. He says, be faithful even to dying. He says, I'll give you victory. And so he promised them that he didn't promise them that they wouldn't die, and he didn't promise them that they wouldn't go through problems and that they wouldn't go through tribulations, but he did promise them an end that would be joyous and joyful. And then he concludes, as he does all of these, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. Now, there's something here that's beautiful, and I want you to see it. It's something that there's no way to translate this. There's no way to get it in English. But if you understand that it's there, it sure does help the heart. Let's look at it. He says, if you have an ear, you got to hear it. Listen up to what he's saying. Listen to what's being said. He who overcomes, he who gains that victor's crown, shall not be hurt. Second death. What's the second death?
Hell.
Hell. Yeah.
Maybe.
2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. Hell. So he says, you shall not be hurt. It's what's called a double negative. In other words, he uses no twice. He uses it for emphasis sake. Now I say, you can't, there's no way to translate that in English because we don't use double negatives. Matter of fact, didn't your teacher always say, if you said, I ain't got no, that's a double negative and you don't do that? Well, that's the reason why. We can't translate that in English where we would say, okay, yeah, God knows what he's talking about. But John is saying, you shall, there is in no way at all will you be hurt by a second death if you remain faithful. It's a beautiful thought, to say the least. Anything anybody like to say, I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts, but anything anybody like to say or ask? Well, what can we learn? Well, we can learn several things. From Smyrna, we can learn that as Christians, we're rich. We have the comfort of God that I think he gives in this verse, or these verses. I think one of the things that while we could list all the blessings, we could go to Ephesians 1 and list all the blessings. We could go to 2 Peter chapter 2 and find more blessings. And we can find blessings throughout the Bible that deal with, here's what the Christian receives, here's what the Christian has. But the comfort that Jesus gave to the church this morning of everything's going to be all right. Yeah, you go through some suffering, some hurt, some death, but that's still all right. You still haven't lost, and you're not finished. I think the second lesson is that the world may oppress us just because of who we are. These folks were just Christians. That was their only crime. Christians. It wasn't that they'd gone out and murdered somebody. It wasn't that they had gone out and abused a child or another individual. They were just Christians. They had a belief, a faith that was different. Does this sound modern day? Modern day intolerance has become what we are. In other words, you can talk about it politically, you can talk about it religiously. If you don't believe the way I believe, you're wrong, and I want nothing to do with you, and I'm going to scream louder than you, make sure that I push you out. The world may oppress us, but just because of who we are. And it's not the first death that we should be overly concerned with. That's kind of what John is saying. You're not being so concerned about if you die. He said it's that second death that if you're faithful, he said, you won't have to worry about it either. Well, we want to ask the question, are we that church? Today we're facing a lot of problems. The church, admittedly, we think, well, Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, we don't face a lot of persecution, not like they did. That's right. But we still face a lot. And it is getting worse, not just here in Middle Tennessee, but the world over. There are missionary reports that I read from time to time and I hear about from other times in other parts of this world, not in the United States, but in other parts of the world, where Christians are literally being beheaded just because they're Christian. And they're being put to death, and they're being tortured just because they're Christian. And we have to ask ourselves about us, we can't answer for the world, but we can answer for us. Are we willing to take that stand for the Lord in the midst of whatever may come our way? Or are we so lack of faith that we're willing to compromise our faith instead of standing for the Lord, being the light that we need to be, being the salt that we need to be, using the metaphor of the invitation? Instead of being what we're supposed to be, are we like and giving in to what the world would have us to be? Great thought. Worthy of consideration. Hopefully we're willing to face the challenges of society. Anything else? Well, let's bow for word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the opportunity to study your word. We're thankful for this letter that was written to this church. We're thankful for the fact that there were those that died, not, and we don't rejoice in their death, but we rejoice in the fact that they died as Christians, willing to stand up for you, the courage and conviction that they had, be faithful even to the point of dying for you. We ask that you give us that courage of conviction as well, that we will live for you, that we will always be the light that we need to be in the world that so loves darkness. We ask that you be with those that were mentioned earlier, that are sick, and those that are hurting. Ask that you bless each one of them's needs as you know best. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us and hold us as we hold thee. This is our prayer in Christ. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.